The starship Indomitable Spirit was not a vessel of grace or aesthetic beauty, but rather a jagged, utilitarian testament to the sheer stubbornness of a species that refused to accept the cold finality of the vacuum. It was a sprawling, asymmetrical construct of lead-lined alloys and reinforced ceramic plating, designed with a philosophy of redundancy that bordered on the obsessive. Every corridor was lined with exposed conduits and manual override levers, a physical manifestation of the human distrust for automated systems that could fail when the light of a distant sun finally flickered out. Commander Theron Vane walked the primary gantry of the engineering deck, the rhythmic thud of his magnetic boots echoing through the cavernous space. The air here was thick, with the scent of ionized ozone and the recycled breath of 3,000 souls, a metallic tang that never truly left the back of one's throat. To his left, the massive containment housing of the Singularity Drive hummed with a low-frequency vibration that Theron felt more in his marrow than in his ears. It was a terrifying piece of technology, a captured point of infinite density that provided the thrust necessary to skip across the folds of spacetime, yet it felt remarkably fragile in the face of the vast, uncaring expanse they were currently traversing. Theron stopped at a monitoring station, his eyes scanning the cascading streams of data that flickered across the haptic interface. The numbers were steady, but the margins were thinning. They were 3 weeks out from the rendezvous point in the Ophiuchus Reach, and the fuel reserves were dipping into the amber zone. It was a calculated risk, the kind of gamble that had defined the human expansion into the stars since the first chemical rockets had breached the atmosphere of Earth centuries ago. They were no longer the dominant predators of a single world. They were the scavengers and pioneers of a galaxy that seemed increasingly hostile to the very concept of biological life. The bridge was a stark contrast to the chaotic machinery of engineering. It was a bowl-shaped amphitheater of hushed whispers and focused intensity, where the ambient light was kept low to preserve the night vision of the bridge crew. Theron took his seat in the center of the room, the leather creaking under his weight. Beside him, Chief Navigator Solar Vance was hunched over her tactical displays, her fingers dancing across the glass with a fluidity that suggested the interface was an extension of her own nervous system. She didn't look up as he approached, her focus entirely on the shifting gravitational shadows of the nebula they were skirting. She was calculating the precise moment to engage the slip drive, a maneuver that required threading the needle between two collapsing gas giants whose tidal forces could tear the Indomitable Spirit into its constituent atoms if they were off by even a fraction of a degree. Theron watched her for a moment, admiring the quiet competence that defined his crew. They were a motley collection of refugees, scientists, and soldiers, unified by the singular goal of reaching the fringe worlds, a rumored sanctuary where the ancient machines of the Vorax had yet to reach. The Vorax were not a faction or an empire in the traditional sense. They were a self-replicating crystalline plague that converted all organic matter into structured computational arrays. They didn't hate humanity, for hate required an emotional capacity they lacked. They simply viewed the carbon-based life forms of the galaxy as inefficient processing units that needed to be recycled. To the Vorax, a human was just a disorganized collection of molecules that could be better utilized as a heat sink or a memory storage node. The silence of the bridge was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic chirping from the long-range sensor array. Theron leaned forward, his pulse quickening. On the primary view screen, the swirling dust of the nebula began to pull back, revealed by a filtered sweep of infrared sensors. A cluster of geometric shapes emerged from the gloom, their surfaces perfectly flat and devoid of any identifiable markings. They were Vorax harvesters, sleek and terrifyingly efficient. There were 12 of them, arranged in a perfect dodecahedron formation, moving with a synchronized grace that made the lumbering, indomitable spirit look like a wounded animal. Theron felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. They weren't supposed to be this far out. The intelligence reports had indicated the Vorax front was stalled at the Perseus arm, held back by the combined remnants of the Galactic Accord. But the Accord was a crumbling ruin of its former self, a collection of panicked species bickering over dwindling resources while their borders collapsed. Humanity had seen the writing on the wall early and chose to run, not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate pragmaticism. If the galaxy was going to burn, they intended to be the ones holding the embers for the next fire. Sola looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. She didn't need to ask for orders. The protocol for a Vorax encounter was well rehearsed and terrifyingly brief. They couldn't outrun them in real space, and jumping to warp this close to a gravitational well was a death sentence. Theron activated the ship-wide intercom, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He informed the crew of the contact, his words measured and calm. He told them to secure all loose equipment and prepare for high-gravity maneuvers. He didn't offer false hope, he offered the truth. They were cornered, and their only chance of survival lay in the very thing the Vorax couldn't calculate: human unpredictability. The harvesters began to accelerate, their crystalline hulls glowing with a faint, pulsing violet light as they prepared their conversion beams. These were not weapons designed to destroy, they were tools designed to dismantle. If a beam hit the ship, it wouldn't explode. It would simply begin to dissolve, the metal and the meat within it turning into a fine, shimmering dust that would be sucked into the maws of the harvesters. Theron watched as the lead harvester peeled away from the formation, its trajectory locking onto their engine housing. He ordered the point defense cannons to fire, knowing full well that their kinetic rounds would likely shatter against the Vorax shields like glass against stone. The ship shuddered as the massive cannons roared to life, sending streaks of white-hot tungsten into the void. The Vorax harvester didn't even flinch, the rounds disintegrating centimeters from its hull. It was a sobering reminder of the technological gulf between them. But Theron had spent his entire life studying the Vorax. He knew their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness, their absolute commitment to logic and efficiency. They operated on algorithms of optimization. They would always take the path of least resistance and the highest yield. Theron signaled the engineering deck, speaking directly to Chief Engineer Miller. He gave a command that seemed like madness. He ordered Miller to vent the primary coolant reserves into the space between the ship and the approaching harvester. It was a desperate move that would leave the Singularity drive dangerously close to a meltdown within minutes, but it was the only way to create a localized distortion in the Vorax's sensory input. As the supercooled liquid nitrogen hit the vacuum, it expanded into a massive, shimmering cloud of ice crystals and gas. To the Vorax sensors, which relied on precise spectroscopic analysis to identify matter, the cloud appeared as a solid, high-density obstacle. The lead harvester, operating on its collision avoidance subroutines, banked sharply to the left. It was a momentary lapse, a glitch in the machine's perfection. Theron seized the opening. He ordered Solar to fire the emergency thrusters, a move that pinned every crew member into their seats with several times the force of gravity. The Indomitable Spirit lurched forward, diving through the gap created by the harvester's maneuver. The ship groaned under the strain, the hull plates shrieking as the tidal forces of the nearby gas giant clawed at them. They were diving deep into the planet's upper atmosphere, using the thick gases as a shield against the Vorax conversion beams. The heat shielding glowed a brilliant orange, and the internal temperature of the bridge began to climb rapidly. Theron watched the sensors, seeing the Vorax harvesters hovering at the edge of the atmosphere, hesitating. Their algorithms were calculating the risk of following a target into a high-pressure, high-turbulence environment where their precision instruments would be hampered. For a machine, the cost-benefit analysis of chasing a single ship into a planetary gravity well often tilted toward abandonment if easier prey was available. But these were not standard drones, they were hunters. After a few agonizing seconds, 3 of the harvesters began their descent, their crystalline hulls cutting through the thick clouds of methane and ammonia like knives. Theron knew they couldn't stay in the atmosphere forever. The pressure would eventually crush them, or the heat would bake the crew alive. He needed a way to turn the environment against their pursuers. He looked at the topographic map of the planet's surface, searching for something, anything, that could give them an edge. He saw it, a massive storm system, a permanent cyclone 3 times the size of Earth, located near the planet's equator. The winds inside that storm reached speeds that could strip the paint off a ship in seconds, and the lightning strikes were powerful enough to short-circuit even the most hardened electronics. To the Vorax, the storm was a zone of total chaos, a place where logic failed. To Theron, it was a sanctuary. He ordered Solar to set a course for the eye of the storm. The crew looked at him with a mix of horror and dawning understanding. They were trading a slow death for a fast one, but in the fast death, they had a fighting chance. As they neared the edge of the cyclone, the Indomitable Spirit began to shake violently. The turbulence was so intense that the inertial dampeners couldn't keep up, and several crew members were tossed from their stations. Theron gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Behind them, the Vorax harvesters were struggling. Their sleek, aerodynamic shapes were not designed for the chaotic, multi-directional winds of a gas giant's interior. One of the harvesters caught a downdraft and was slammed into a lower atmospheric layer, the pressure instantly imploding its crystalline structure. Another was struck by a massive bolt of lightning, its shields overloading and its conversion beams firing wildly into the clouds. The third harvester, however, was persistent. It had adjusted its flight path, mimicking the Indomitable Spirit's movements with terrifying precision. It was closing the distance, its violet light glowing brighter as it prepared to fire. Theron knew they were running out of time. He looked at Miller's terminal, seeing the singularity drive's temperature rising into the red. They were minutes away from a catastrophic failure. He made a split-second decision. He ordered Miller to decouple the secondary power couplings and channel all remaining energy into the rear deflectors. It was a suicidal move that would leave them without shields on the front and sides, but it would create a momentary surge in the rear field. As the Vorax harvester fired its conversion beam, the beam hit the overloaded rear deflector and was refracted, scattering into the surrounding storm clouds. The energy discharge triggered a chain reaction in the highly ionized atmosphere, creating a massive explosion of plasma. The shockwave hit the harvester full force, tumbling it end over end. Before the machine could recover, Theron ordered Solar to execute a blind jump. It was the ultimate gamble. They didn't have a clear exit vector, and jumping from within an atmosphere was theoretically impossible according to every textbook ever written. But humans had a long history of ignoring what was supposed to be impossible. The singularity drive roared, the sound transitioning from a low hum to a high-pitched scream that tore through the ship. The space in front of the Indomitable Spirit began to warp and stretch, the stars becoming long streaks of light. For a heartbeat, Theron felt his soul being pulled from his body, a sensation of infinite cold and infinite heat. And then, with a bone-jarring thud, the ship emerged into the blackness of deep space. The bridge was silent, the only sound the frantic clicking of cooling metal and the ragged breathing of the crew. Theron looked at the sensors. The nebula was gone, the gas giant was gone, the Vorax were gone. They were in the middle of nowhere, drifting in the void between star systems, but they were alive. He looked at Sola, who was slumped over her console, her face pale but a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. They had survived the first encounter, but Theron knew this was only the beginning. The Vorax would learn from this. They would adapt, but so would humanity. As he sat back in his chair, Theron realized that the most powerful weapon they possessed wasn't the singularity drive or the tungsten cannons. It was the sheer, irrational refusal to give up, the willingness to dive into the heart of a storm just to see what was on the other side. They were a species of survivors, and as long as they had one more breath to take, they would keep fighting. He looked out into the darkness, searching for the faint glimmer of the fringe worlds. They had a long way to go, and the galaxy was full of shadows, but for the first time in a long time, Theron felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt since leaving Earth: hope. It was a fragile thing, like a candle in a hurricane, but it was enough to light the way forward. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly, and began to give orders to assess the damage. They had work to do. The Indomitable Spirit was battered, bruised, and nearly broken, but she was still flying, and that was all that mattered. The transition back into real space was not a clean break, but a violent expulsion, as if the universe itself were trying to vomit the Indomitable Spirit out of its forbidden folds. Theron felt the phantom pressure of the slip drive jump lingering in his sinuses, a dull ache that pulsed with every beat of his heart. The bridge was a chaotic symphony of sparking consoles and the sharp, rhythmic wail of emergency klaxons. Thick, acrid smoke curled from an auxiliary navigation station, obscuring the view of the forward monitors. Sola was already upright, her hands blurred as she bypassed fried circuits to restore primary life support. They were no longer near the gas giant. The sensors indicated they had overshot their intended exit point by several light years, dumping them into a region of space marked on the charts as the Void of Omen. It was a desolate expanse, far from any established trade routes or planetary systems, where the light of the galaxy's core was muted by ancient, cold dust. Theron gripped the edge of his command chair, waiting for his vision to stabilize. He looked at the status board and saw a sea of crimson icons. The hull integrity was at 60%. The singularity drive was cycling through an emergency shutdown to prevent a core breach, and their long-range communications array was nothing more than a melted stump of twisted metal on the outer hull. They were blind, deaf, and limping through the dark, but they were still breathing. That was the only metric that mattered in the immediate aftermath of a Vorax pursuit. He wiped a smudge of soot from his forehead and looked at the crew. They were battered, some bleeding from minor cuts, but their eyes remained fixed on their tasks. This was the human condition in the current era, a perpetual state of frantic repair while waiting for the next catastrophe to strike from the shadows. In the belly of the ship, Chief Engineer Miller was knee-deep in iridescent coolant fluid, his arms covered in chemical burns that he seemed entirely to ignore. The engineering deck was a tomb of groaning metal and escaping steam. The singularity drive housing was glowing with a dull, malevolent cherry-red heat, a sign that the containment fields were struggling to hold back the miniature sun they carried in their gut. Miller barked orders to his technicians, his voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the hiss of the ruptured pipes. They had to manually reset the magnetic baffles, a task that required crawling into the maintenance crawl spaces while the ship was still settling from the jump. One of the younger engineers, a woman named Hina, hesitated at the entrance of a narrow vent that was venting superheated vapor. Miller grabbed her shoulder, not with aggression, but with a grounding weight. He told her that the ship didn't care about her fear, and neither did the Vorax. He told her that the only thing keeping them from becoming a cloud of expanding plasma was her ability to turn a wrench in the dark. It was a brutal form of encouragement, but it worked. Hina took a deep breath, donned her thermal mask, and disappeared into the venting steam. It was this granular level of heroism that kept the indomitable spirit alive. It wasn't just the grand tactical decisions made on the bridge. It was the hundreds of individuals choosing to risk their lives in the cramped, dangerous corners of the machine to ensure the collective survived another hour. Theron watched the internal monitors as the engineering team began the grueling process of stabilization. He knew they couldn't stay stationary for long. Even in the void of omen, the Vorax would eventually find the gravitational ripple caused by their messy jump. The machines were relentless trackers, capable of detecting the unique harmonic signature of a singularity drive across vast distances. He needed a place to hide, a place to mask their energy signature while they conducted repairs. He turned to Solar and asked for a scan of the immediate vicinity, looking for anything with high background radiation or dense physical matter. Solar squinted at her flickering screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. She found a rogue planetoid, a dark mass of iron and silicate drifting through the void without a parent star. It was a dead world, frozen to near absolute zero, but it had a deep network of subterranean canyons formed by ancient tectonic shifts. If they could tuck the indomitable spirit into one of those trenches, the natural mineral deposits would act as a Faraday cage, shielding their heat and electromagnetic emissions from long-range probes. It was a gamble, as the planetoid's gravity was erratic and its surface was a graveyard of jagged peaks, but they had no other choice. Theron gave the order to move, using the thrusters in short, controlled bursts to conserve what little fuel they had left. The approach to the rogue planetoid, which the computer designated as OP-992, was a harrowing exercise in precision. Without the primary navigation computer, Solar had to calculate the descent vectors using a handheld transit and the ship's basic proximity sensors. The indomitable spirit descended into the darkness, its external lights cutting through the eternal night of the planetoid's surface. The canyons were deeper and narrower than the initial scans suggested, their walls looming like the ribs of some gargantuan, long-dead beast. The ship scraped against a protruding shelf of rock, the sound of grinding metals screeching through the hull like a dying scream. Theron held his breath, praying the structural supports would hold. Finally, they settled into a wide basin at the bottom of a 3-mile-deep rift. The ship landed with a heavy, metallic thud, sending a cloud of frozen dust swirling into the airless environment. Theron ordered all non-essential systems to be powered down, including the internal lighting. The bridge plunged into a dim, red-hued twilight, the only illumination coming from the emergency glow strips on the floor. It was a necessary precaution to minimize their thermal footprint. They were now a ghost ship inside a tomb, waiting for the galaxy to forget they existed. While the repairs commenced, Theron retreated to his small, Spartan quarters to review the data logs they had managed to salvage from the encounter near the gas giant. He obsessed over the sensor readings of the Vorax harvesters. Something about their behavior bothered him. Usually, the Vorax were purely reactive, moving toward the largest concentration of biological mass. But these harvesters had seemed targeted, almost as if they were looking for the indomitable spirit specifically. He began to wonder if there was something on board the ship that they wanted, something more than just the raw materials of their bodies. He pulled up the manifest of the cargo they had taken on at the last Accord station before it fell. Most of it was standard: medical supplies, seeds for a new colony, refined alloys. But there was one crate, designated as Priority Zero, that had been delivered by a group of silent, armored couriers from the inner systems. It was listed as a high-density data core containing the cultural archives of the species lost to the Vorax. Theron had assumed it was a symbolic gesture, a digital library to preserve the memory of the fallen. Now, he wasn't so sure. He left his quarters and made his way to the secure storage hold in the lower decks, his footsteps muffled by the recycled rubber matting of the corridors. The storage hold was a cavernous space filled with the remnants of a dozen civilizations. There were statues from worlds that no longer existed, crates of handwritten scrolls from a species that had communicated through touch, and stacks of hard drives containing the genetic blueprints of extinct flora and fauna. In the center of the room sat the Priority Zero crate. It was smaller than he expected, no larger than a footlocker, and made of a dull, non-reflective material that seemed to absorb the light from his flashlight. He didn't have the authorization codes to open it, but he didn't need to. He ran a handheld scanner over its surface and noticed a faint, high-frequency oscillation that wasn't consistent with a standard data storage unit. This wasn't just a library, it was a transmitter or perhaps a beacon. If the Vorax were tracking this crate, then the Indomitable Spirit wasn't a ship of refugees, it was a lure. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Galactic Accord, in its dying gasps, might have used them as a distraction to draw the Vorax away from other evacuation routes, or perhaps they had entrusted humanity with something far more dangerous than just memories. Theron felt a surge of anger, a hot, prickly heat that rose up his neck. They were being hunted not because they were survivors, but because they were carrying a target on their backs without even knowing it. He returned to the bridge, his mind racing. He couldn't tell the crew yet. Morale was already a fragile thing, held together by the hope of reaching the fringe worlds. If they knew they were being used as bait, that hope would evaporate. He found Sola staring out the forward view screen at the dark canyon walls. She looked exhausted, the lines around her eyes deepened by the stress of the last 48 hours. She asked him if he thought they would ever see a sun again, a real sun that didn't require a filter to look at. Theron didn't answer immediately. He thought about the forests of Earth, the smell of rain on hot pavement, and the sound of birds in the early morning, things he had only seen in history files but felt an ache for nonetheless. He told her that they would see a sun, but it might not be the one they were looking for. He told her that humanity had a habit of making its own light when the stars went out. Sola managed a weak smile and went back to her work. Theron sat in his chair and looked at the sensor logs again. If the crate was a beacon, they had to find a way to mask it or dump it. But if it contained something vital for the survival of the species, something that could actually stop the Vorax, he couldn't just throw it into the void. Hours bled into a single, seamless stretch of exertion. Miller reported that the Singularity drive was stable enough for a low-power jump, though it would be a bumpy ride and they wouldn't have enough energy for shields. They had patched the hull with emergency foam and internal bracing, but the ship was still a patchwork of compromises. Theron was about to give the order to prepare for departure when the sensors suddenly spiked. It wasn't a Vorax harvester. It was something much larger, a massive silhouette that blotted out the stars at the mouth of the canyon. It was a Vorax mothership, a monolithic structure of interlocking crystalline towers that spanned several kilometers in length. It moved with a terrifying silence, its presence heralded only by the distortion of the gravitational fields around the planetoid. It wasn't searching, it was positioning itself. The machines had calculated their hiding spot with mathematical certainty. Theron felt a cold wave of resignation wash over him, followed quickly by a sharp, jagged defiance. They were trapped at the bottom of a well with a predator looking down at them. He looked at the Priority Zero crate's location on his monitor. If the Vorax wanted what was inside, he would make sure they had to bleed for every byte of data. He began to formulate a plan, one that would require the Indomitable Spirit to do something it was never designed for. They weren't just going to run this time. They were going to fight back with the only thing a machine couldn't anticipate, a sacrifice that made no logical sense. He called Miller and Solar to a private channel, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. He told them about the crate and his suspicions. He told them that the mothership was there for the beacon. He proposed a plan to use the ship's internal venting system to create a deceptive heat signature on the other side of the planetoid, while they used the low gravity to skip the ship along the canyon floor like a stone across water. It was a maneuver that would likely tear the ship's landing gear off and might cause a structural collapse, but it was their only chance to get behind the mothership's primary sensor array. Miller grumbled about the engineering impossibility of it, but Theron could hear the gears turning in the older man's head. Solar simply nodded, her fingers already beginning to plot the manual thruster bursts. They were humans. They were experts at making the impossible look like a Tuesday afternoon. As the Vorax mothership began to lower its primary harvester beams toward the canyon, the Indomitable Spirit came to life, not with a roar, but with a desperate, shuddering groan. The hunt was on again, but this time the prey had teeth. Theron strapped himself into his seat, the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him. He wasn't just a commander anymore. He was a gambler playing for the highest stakes in the galaxy. He looked at the dark rock rushing past the windows and felt a strange, fierce joy. They were still alive, and as long as they were alive, the Vorax hadn't won. The Indomitable Spirit did not so much fly as it screamed through the basalt corridors of the canyon, its ventral thrusters firing in short, violent spasms that kicked up plumes of frozen regolith and crystalline dust. Theron felt the deck plates buck beneath his boots, the internal dampeners struggling to compensate for the erratic, lateral G-forces. Every proximity alarm on the bridge was a constant, flatline wail, indicating that the hull was mere meters from the jagged rock walls. Solar was standing now, her feet braced wide, her eyes locked on the wireframe holographic projection of the trench ahead. She wasn't using the flight stick. She was overriding the thruster valves manually, bypasses open, venting pressurized gas to kick the ship's tail around the sharper bends. The screech of metal on stone was a physical presence, a vibration that rattled Theron's teeth and made the displays blur. They were pushing the structural integrity of a deep space freighter to the limits of a planetary atmospheric racer, and the ship was complaining in every bolt and seam. Behind them, the Vorax mothership had begun its descent into the primary basin, its massive shadow eclipsing the faint starlight. The conversion beams it projected were not localized pulses, but wide, sweeping curtains of violet energy that turned the canyon floor into a liquid slurry of molecular soup. The machines were not hunting. They were strip mining the planetoid to find the ship. Theron watched the rear-facing cameras as a towering spire of rock behind them simply dissolved, collapsing into a shimmering fog of gray ash as the Vorax beam touched it. The efficiency was terrifying. There was no fire, no explosion, just the quiet erasure of matter. He keyed the internal channel to the cargo bay, where a small team led by a veteran spacer named Kaeris was prepping the deco. They had rigged a heavy industrial power cell to the Priority Zero crate's casing, overriding the safety limiters to create a massive, unstable electromagnetic pulse. If they timed it right, they could jettison the crate into a side canyon, where the power cell would overload and bloom into a heat signature that mimicked a failing singularity drive. It was a heart-wrenching decision to use the cultural archives of a dozen worlds as a mere distraction, but Theron knew that memories were useless if there was no one left to remember them. He gave the order to stand by. The Indomitable Spirit banked hard to the right, the portside stabilizing fin shearing off against a protruding ledge with a shower of sparks that illuminated the dark trench like a solar flare. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound of twisting girders, but it held. Solar shouted over the din, reporting a narrow exit veering off the main canyon. It was a lava tube, ancient and hollowed out, barely wide enough for the ship's midsection. If they took it, they would be blind and trapped if the Vorax followed, but it would lead them to the opposite side of the planetoid, away from the mothership's primary sensor sweep. Theron didn't hesitate. He told her to take the shot. As the ship lunged into the pitch-black tunnel, he signaled Kaeris to drop the decoy. The crate was ejected from the rear vent, tumbling into the darkness of the main trench. Seconds later, the power cell detonated. Even through the thick hull, Theron felt the thump of the EMP. On the sensors, a massive bloom of white light appeared behind them, drawing the attention of the Vorax harvesters like moths to a flame. The violet beams shifted away from their actual position, converging on the ghost signal. The Indomitable Spirit plunged deeper into the lava tube, the external lights off, the crew holding their collective breath as the ship scraped along the ceiling and floor simultaneously. The sound was a rhythmic thud-thud-thud, the heartbeat of a dying giant. Inside the tube, the temperature began to rise. The friction of the hull against the rock, combined with the overworked engines, was turning the interior into a furnace. Miller reported from engineering that the secondary cooling loops had failed, and they were venting atmosphere into the engine room just to keep the primary core from melting through the floor. Theron looked at the environmental monitors. Oxygen levels were dropping as they used the precious air to cool the machinery. It was a grim irony. They were suffocating themselves to stay in motion. He saw the sweat pouring down Solar's face, her uniform soaked, her hands shaking from the strain of the manual overrides. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. She didn't look back, but her grip on the controls tightened. They were reaching the end of the tube, a jagged opening that looked out onto the vast, empty plains of the planetoid's far side. Beyond that lay the jump point, a clear line of sight out of the gravity well where they could re-engage the singularity drive and vanish into the void of Omen once more. As they burst out of the tunnel, the sudden lack of friction made the ship lurch forward like a released spring, but the relief was short-lived. Hovering directly above the exit was a single Vorax scout, a jagged diamond of obsidian glass that had been waiting for them. It hadn't fallen for the decoy. It had calculated the most likely escape route and positioned itself with the cold, mathematical patience of a predator at a watering hole. The scout didn't fire a conversion beam. Instead, it launched a series of harpoon-like anchors, crystalline spikes trailed by shimmering filaments of energy. Two of them punched through the Indomitable Spirit's hull near the stern, locking into the engine housing. The ship jerked to a halt, the engines screaming in protest as the filaments began to drain power directly from the singularity core. It was a parasitic strike, designed to immobilize the prey and feed on its energy before the final harvest. Theron felt the ship losing power, the lights flickering and dying, the artificial gravity failing as they drifted in the low-gravity environment. The bridge crew was weightless, floating in the dim red glow of the emergency lights. Theron grabbed a handrail, pulling himself toward the tactical station. The scout was pulling them in, reeling them toward its central moor. He looked at the weapons status. The kinetic cannons were offline due to the power drain. The only thing they had left was the ship itself. He called Miller, his voice a strained whisper in the thinning air. He asked the engineer if they could reverse the polarity of the singularity drive's containment field for a fraction of a second. Miller's voice came back, sounding distant and hollow. He said that doing so would create a localized gravitational pulse that would either snap the filaments or collapse the ship's own internal structure. It was a coin flip with their lives on the line. Theron told him to do it on his mark. He watched the scout closing the distance, the crystalline surface reflecting the dim light of distant stars. He waited until the two vessels were nearly touching, until he could see the intricate, shifting patterns of the Vorax circuitry within the glass. He gave the word. The Indomitable Spirit didn't move, but the space around it seemed to fold in on itself. A massive, invisible shockwave of gravitational force rippled outward from the engine room. The Vorax filaments didn't just snap, they shattered like frozen glass. The scout, caught in the epicenter of the pulse, was crumpled like a piece of paper, its perfect geometric lines distorted into a jagged ruin. The backlash sent the Indomitable Spirit spinning wildly away, tumbling end over end across the frozen plains. Theron was thrown against the bulkhead, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs and leaving his vision swimming in stars. He fought for consciousness, hearing the muffled shouts of the crew and the sound of escaping gas. They were spinning toward a mountain range, a wall of black rock that promised a swift end to their journey. Sola was struggling to reach the controls, her body flailing in the zero-gravity environment. Theron pushed off the wall, launching himself toward the pilot's seat. He caught the edge of the console, his fingers clawing for the emergency thruster ignite. With a final, desperate surge of power, the ship's nose lifted. The thrusters roared one last time, a defiant bellow that pushed them up and over the mountain peaks. They cleared the ridge by less than 20 meters, the belly of the ship kissing the highest crags. As they reached the upper atmosphere, or what passed for it on the airless rock, the singularity drive finally stabilized. The core roared back to life, the familiar hum returning to the deck plates. Theron didn't wait for a formal calculation. He jammed the jump sequence, bypasses be damned. The universe blurred, the stars stretched into white needles, and the rogue planetoid vanished. They were back in the fold, moving at speeds that defied physics, leaving the Vorax mothership far behind in the dark. Theron slumped back into his seat, his chest heaving. The air was cold and thin, his head ached, and his body was covered in bruises, but he started to laugh. It was a dry, hacking sound that eventually turned into a genuine chuckle. They had outplayed the machines. They had used their own history as a shield and their own engine as a hammer. As the ship settled into the long-haul jump, the bridge crew began to find their footing. Sola climbed back into her chair, her face bruised but her eyes shining with a fierce, unbreakable light. They had lost the DK, they had lost a stabilizer fin, and the ship was held together by little more than hope and emergency foam, but they were still here. Theron looked at the empty spot on his monitor where the Priority Zero crate had been listed. He felt a pang of loss for the archives, for the stories and songs of the dead that were now likely being dismantled by the Vorax. But then he looked at his crew. He saw Miller on the internal feed, sharing a drink of recycled water with Hina. He saw the navigators checking their charts and the technicians repairing the life support. He realized that the archives weren't just in a box, they were in the people. As long as they survived, the stories survived. They were the living library of the human race, a species that refused to be quiet in the face of the end. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the vibration of the ship soothe his frayed nerves. They were still heading for the fringe worlds. The journey was far from over, and the shadows were still long, but the Indomitable Spirit was a name they earned every single day. The silence that followed was not one of defeat, but of preparation. They had 6 hours until the next jump point, 6 hours to patch the leaks and mourn the things they had left behind. Theron knew the Vorax would not stop. The mothership would have sent out long-range hunters the moment the scout went dark. But he also knew something the Vorax didn't. He knew that a cornered human was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy but steady. He had to go to the lower decks, to look the survivors in the eyes and tell them that they were still moving. He had to remind them that every breath they took was a victory against the void. As he walked toward the lift, he caught his reflection in a darkened monitor. He looked older, more tired, but there was a hardness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just running anymore. He was leading a migration of ghosts toward a new dawn, and he would be damned if he let the fire go out on his watch. The transit through the higher dimensions of the slipstream was usually a period of enforced lethargy, a time where the crew could succumb to the biological necessity of sleep, while the singularity drive did the heavy lifting of folding space. However, on the Indomitable Spirit, the atmosphere was anything but restful. The ship was bleeding. Microfractures in the secondary hull plating whistled with the haunting sound of escaping internal pressure, a high-pitched keening that defied the vacuum outside. Theron moved through the lower decks, his hands trailing along the cold, vibrating bulkheads. He passed the medical bay, where the smell of antiseptic and burnt flesh was overwhelming. There were no more beds, only stretchers lined up in the corridors. He saw a young technician, barely 20, clutching a piece of a shattered crystalline anchor like a morbid trophy. The boy's eyes were glassy, fixed on a point beyond the hull. Theron didn't stop to offer platitudes. He knew that at this stage of their exodus, words were less valuable than a functional oxygen scrubber. He reached the secondary machine shop, where Miller was overseeing the fabrication of makeshift hull patches. The air was thick with the scent of molten solder and recycled carbon. Miller looked up, his face a mask of grease and exhaustion, and gave a curt nod. They were stripping the non-essential interior partitions to reinforce the engine room bulkheads. It was a cannibalization of their own home to keep the heart of the ship beating. Theron found a quiet corner near the water reclamation units and sat on a crate of dehydrated rations. He needed a moment of stillness, a chance to process the loss of the Priority Zero archive. He felt a profound sense of failure, as if he had personally burned a library containing the only record of 1 billion souls. But as he watched the engineers work, he saw something else. He saw a woman from the Rigel colonies teaching a teenager from the Martian basin how to calibrate a magnetic flux coupler. He saw an elder from the Jovian moons sharing a meager ration bar with a child who had lost his parents at the last jump point. These were the living archives. The data core had been a collection of static facts, but these people were the continuity of culture. They carried the recipes, the jokes, the architectural theories, and the stubborn philosophy of 1,000 different human outposts. If the Vorax wanted the data, they would find it empty and cold. The heat of the human spirit was something that couldn't be encoded onto a silicon wafer or a crystalline lattice. It was an emergent property of struggle. Theron stood up, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't mourn the box. He would protect the contents that were currently breathing and sweating around him. He returned to the bridge to find Solar staring at a sensor ghost that shouldn't have been there. In the strange, distorted physics of the slipstream, external sensors were mostly useless, yet a rhythmic pulse was registering on the gravimetric shear plates. It was a steady, mechanical throb that matched the Indomitable Spirit's own stride. Theron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the failing life support. The Vorax had developed a method of tracking ships through the folds of spacetime itself. They weren't just following a trail, they were tethered to the ship's wake. He realized then that the jump to the fringe worlds wouldn't be a clean escape. They were bringing the plague with them. He looked at the charts, his mind racing through tactical permutations. If they dropped out of the slipstream now, they would be in the middle of a stellar nursery, a dense cloud of ionized gas and protostars where navigation was a nightmare. But if they stayed in the stream, the Vorax would simply wait for them to emerge at their destination and execute them while they were most vulnerable. Theron called a meeting of the senior staff in the cramped briefing room adjacent to the bridge. The lighting flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across their weary faces. He explained the situation with the tracking pulse. He told them that the Vorax were no longer just harvesting, they were pursuing with an intent that suggested a higher-level intelligence was directing the swarm. He proposed a radical maneuver, a double-back jump. They would drop out of the slipstream in the heart of the stellar nursery, use the intense radiation of the birthing stars to mask a second, immediate jump in a completely different direction. It was a maneuver that would put immense strain on the singularity drive, likely redlining the containment fields to the point of collapse. Miller was the first to speak, his voice a low growl. He pointed out that the drive was already held together by prayers and baling wire. A double jump could turn the Indomitable Spirit into a localized supernova, but Solar countered, noting that if they didn't shake the tail, they were dead anyway. It was the choice between a guaranteed end and a catastrophic possibility. As they debated, a sudden jolt rocked the ship. It wasn't an external hit, it was an internal surge. The tracking pulse from the Vorax had intensified, creating a harmonic resonance with the ship's own gravity drive. The bridge crew reported that the hull was beginning to vibrate at a frequency that was literally shaking the bolts out of the frames. The Vorax were using the tether to dismantle the ship from the inside out while still in transit. Theron ended the meeting instantly. There was no more time for debate. He ordered everyone to their stations and told Miller to prep the drive for an emergency exit. They had to break the tether before the ship disintegrated. Solar gripped the controls, her knuckles white, as she fought the vibrating yoke. The scream of the drive reached a deafening crescendo, a sound that felt like it was tearing through the very fabric of reality. Theron watched the integrity monitors. The internal atmosphere was venting in a dozen places, and the artificial gravity was fluctuating wildly. On his command, they cut the power to the singularity drive. The transition back to real space was a bone-shattering impact. The Indomitable Spirit tumbled into the chaotic heart of the Orion Beta nursery. Outside, the view was a kaleidoscopic nightmare of glowing neon gases and blindingly bright infant stars. The radiation alarms screamed as the ship was bathed in the unfiltered output of 1,000 suns. The Vorax Hunter, a sleek, needle-like vessel designed for slipstream pursuit, emerged seconds later, but it was caught off guard by the sheer density of the plasma clouds. The radiation interfered with its crystalline sensors, causing it to veer wildly. Theron didn't give it a chance to recover. He ordered the release of the remaining cooling canisters, creating a massive cloud of opaque gas that hid their silhouette from visual and infrared tracking. Beneath the cover of the nebula, they began the frantic process of spooling the drive for the second jump. The heat inside the ship was becoming unbearable. Without the primary cooling loops, the bridge was a sauna, and the air was growing thin and metallic. Theron watched the Vorax Hunter through a narrow optical port, seeing it fire its conversion beams blindly into the gas clouds. Each beam carved a path of ionized fire through the nebula, coming closer and closer to their position. Miller's voice came over the comms, breathless and urgent. He said the drive was at 90%, but the containment seals were melting. They had to go now, or they would never go again. Theron looked at Solar, who was squinting against the glare of a nearby protostar. She nodded, her face set in a grim mask of determination. They weren't just running for their lives, they were running for the future of a species that refused to go extinct. The second jump was a blur of agony. Theron felt his heart skip a beat as the ship was wrenched back into the slipstream. The scream of the metal was so loud it drowned out the alarms. For a moment, he thought the ship had actually split in two, but then the vibrations stopped. The tracking pulse was gone. They had severed the tether in the chaos of the nursery. They were alone in the dark once more, drifting through the higher dimensions toward an uncertain horizon. Theron slumped in his chair, his vision swimming. He looked at the status board. The singularity drive was a total loss, fused into a solid mass of slag. They had enough momentum to carry them to the edge of the fringe worlds, but they would be arriving as a derelict, a drifting hulk of metal with no way to turn back. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic, labored breathing of his crew. They had survived the hunt, but the price had been their last means of escape. They were committed now. There was no more running. Whatever they found at the end of this journey would be their final stand. As the adrenaline began to fade, a heavy silence settled over the bridge. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of the weary. They were 3,000 souls on a broken ship, light years from anything resembling a home, carrying nothing but their memories and a stubborn refusal to die. Theron realized that this was the true weight of a single breath, the collective effort of an entire species to keep one more person alive for one more minute. He reached out and touched the scarred metal of the command console, feeling the warmth of the overworked electronics. The Indomitable Spirit was more than a ship, it was a promise. And as long as its hull held, he would keep that promise. He looked at Sola, who had fallen asleep at her station, her head resting on her arms. He didn't wake her. They had a long way to go, and for now, the darkness was quiet. He leaned back, staring into the swirling colors of the slipstream, wondering what kind of world awaited them on the other side. It didn't matter, he decided. They would make it home, even if they had to build it from the wreckage of their own dreams. The arrival at the outer periphery of the fringe worlds was not the triumphant emergence Theron had once envisioned in the quiet hours of his youth. Instead, the Indomitable Spirit drifted out of the slipstream like a piece of cosmic flotsam, its momentum spent and its primary propulsion a dead mass of fused isotopes. The transition back to the three dimensions of conventional space was sluggish, a slow unfolding of reality that felt like waking from a heavy, drug-induced fever. Theron looked at the main viewscreen, which flickered with static and chromatic aberration. Before them lay the Ophiuchus Reach, a dense cluster of ancient stars and debris disks that formed a natural barrier against the wider galaxy. It was a graveyard of celestial evolution, filled with the husks of dead planets and the glowing remains of supernovae that had cooled over millions of years. Somewhere within this labyrinth was the sanctuary they had been promised, a hidden Dyson swarm of habitats known as the Last Bastion. But as the long-range sensors groaned to life, sending a ping into the vastness, the return signal was not the welcoming beacon of a civilization. It was the cold, rhythmic pulse of automated defense grids and the silent drift of wreckage. Theron felt a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of recycled oxygen could soothe. They had traveled across the burning breadth of the galaxy, only to find that the end had arrived here before them. The bridge was freezing. With the singularity drive offline, the life support systems were running on emergency battery arrays that prioritized the atmosphere over thermal regulation. The crew was bundled in thick, insulated flight suits, their breath frosting in the air like tiny, ephemeral spirits. Sola sat at her station, her hands gloved, trying to filter the sensor noise. She reported that the region was littered with high-density metal signatures, thousands of them, orbiting a central yellow dwarf star. It wasn't just debris, it was a fleet, but the thermal signatures were flat, indicating no active reactors or life signs. Theron ordered a low-power telescopic sweep of the nearest cluster. The images that resolved on the screen were heartbreaking. They were Accord vessels, transports, cruisers, and civilian liners, all floating in a state of perfect, terrifying preservation. There were no scorch marks, no jagged holes from kinetic rounds. The ships looked as if they had simply stopped. Theron knew what this was. This was the work of a Vorax damping field, a high-frequency broadcast that neutralized the bioelectrical impulses of organic nervous systems while leaving the machinery intact for later recycling. The people on those ships hadn't died in a battle, they had simply ceased to be. Miller came up to the bridge, his face pale and his eyes rimmed with red. He had been working in the bowels of the ship for 72 hours straight, trying to coax enough power from the auxiliary solar sails to give them some form of maneuverability. He looked at the screen and let out a long, shuddering breath. He whispered that they were a ghost ship entering a ghost city. Theron didn't look away from the display. He saw a massive orbital habitat, a ring-shaped structure that should have been home to millions, spinning slowly and aimlessly against the backdrop of the star. It was intact, its lights still twinkling with the mindless persistence of automated timers. The Vorax were not here, which was the only mercy they had been granted. The machines had moved on, having harvested the consciousness of the fringe worlds, leaving the physical husks behind like empty shells on a beach. Theron realized that the Indomitable Spirit was likely the last concentrated gathering of human life in this quadrant of the galaxy. The weight of that realization was staggering, a pressure that felt as if it were trying to collapse his lungs. They weren't just survivors, they were the final witnesses. He called for a ship-wide broadcast, his voice cracking slightly before he regained his composure. He told the 3,000 souls on board exactly what they were looking at. He didn't sugarcoat the devastation. He told them that the sanctuary was a tomb, but then he told them something else. He told them that the Vorax had made a mistake. The machines operated on the principle of maximum efficiency, which meant they only took what was easy to process. They had harvested the centers of the Accord because the populations were dense and the defenses were predictable. But the Indomitable Spirit was still here because it was none of those things. It was a ship of outcasts who had learned to live in the margins, to breathe the thin air of the impossible. He told the crew that if the machines thought they could just leave the lights on in an empty house, they were wrong. Humanity was going to move in. He ordered the deployment of the EVA teams. They weren't going to hide anymore. They were going to scavenge the ghost fleet. They would take the fuel, the processors, the spare parts, and the air from the dead ships to rebuild their own. They would turn the graveyard into a shipyard. The next few weeks were a fever dream of frantic activity. The Indomitable Spirit moved through the debris field like a scavenger beetle, tethering itself to abandoned cruisers and venting their remaining resources into its own parched systems. Theron led one of the first boarding parties into a derelict Accord medical frigate. Stepping through the airlock was like stepping into a moment frozen in time. In the mess hall, trays of synthetic protein sat on tables next to half-finished games of cards. In the infirmary, the monitors still chirped with the flatline signals of patients who had been gone for months. There was no blood, no violence, just a profound, echoing stillness. Kaeris, the veteran spacer, walked beside him, her pulse rifle held low. She remarked that it felt like they were robbing a cathedral. Theron shook his head. He said they weren't robbing it, they were honoring the people who had built it by making sure their tools didn't go to waste. They worked in shifts, stripping the derelicts of anything useful. They found a functional fusion core in a heavy freighter and spent 4 days tethering it to the Indomitable Spirit's hull, a massive, external heart that would provide them with the power they so desperately needed. As the ship began to glow with renewed energy, the morale of the crew underwent a strange transformation. The despair of finding a dead sanctuary was replaced by a grim, workmanlike focus. They were no longer refugees, they were pioneers of the aftermath. Solar managed to interface with the central computer of the orbital habitat, downloading its navigational archives. She found something the Vorax had overlooked in their haste to move to the next sector, a hidden research station located in the shadow of a black hole at the very edge of the reach. The station, designated as Event Horizon Alpha, had been working on a theoretical weapon, a localized entropy field that could theoretically disrupt the crystalline bonds of the Vorax. It was a long shot, a piece of experimental science that might not even exist, but it was a goal. It gave them a direction. Theron looked at the coordinates and then at his ship. The Indomitable Spirit was now a monstrous, beautiful Frankenstein of a vessel, its hull covered in mismatched plating and external modules from a dozen different civilizations. It was ugly, it was loud, and it was the most powerful thing in the system. But the activity hadn't gone unnoticed. In the cold, dark spaces between the stars, a Vorax sentinel had been left behind to monitor the recycling process. It was a gargantuan, spider-like construct of obsidian glass, hidden in the sensor shadows of a moon. It had watched the Indomitable Spirit move through the fleet, its processors calculating the breach of protocol. To the Vorax, a survivor was an error in the equation, and the Vorax were designed to correct errors. Theron was on the bridge when the moon's shadow began to shift. The Sentinel didn't broadcast a warning. It simply detached from the rock and began its acceleration. It was 10 times the size of their ship, a monolith of geometric perfection that moved with a terrifying, silent momentum. The sensors on the bridge screamed a warning that was echoed by the vibration in the floor. Theron felt a surge of adrenaline, but this time it wasn't accompanied by fear. It was accompanied by a cold, sharp clarity. They had spent months running, hiding, and scavenging. They had seen the end of their world and survived it. They were finished with being prey. He ordered the ship to turn and face the Sentinel. Miller, on the engineering feed, shouted that the fusion core wasn't fully shielded yet and that a direct hit would vaporize the ship. Theron told him to shunt the excess heat into the forward deflectors. Solar locked the targeting computers on the Sentinel's central joints. They didn't have the sophisticated conversion beams of the Vorax, but they had something else, the combined kinetic weaponry of 5 different Accord ships they had salvaged. As the Sentinel closed the distance, its crystalline limbs glowing with violet energy, the Indomitable Spirit opened fire. It was a chaotic, overwhelming barrage of tungsten slugs, plasma bolts, and railgun spikes. The space between the two vessels became a storm of white-hot projectiles. The Sentinel's shields flared, absorbing the impact, but the sheer volume of fire began to overwhelm its processors. The Vorax were used to fighting organized fleets with predictable tactics. They weren't prepared for a single, crazed vessel firing everything it had at once. The Sentinel fired its primary beam, a wide swath of violet light that caught the Indomitable Spirit on the port side. The external modules they had scavenged disintegrated instantly, and the hull shrieked as the molecular bonds were torn apart, but the fusion core held. Theron felt the ship lurch, the artificial gravity failing for a heartbeat before snapping back. He didn't look at the damage reports. He kept his eyes on the Sentinel. He ordered the release of the anchor bombs, massive crates of refined isotopes they had rigged with proximity sensors. As the Sentinel moved in for the kill, expecting a fleeing target, the crates drifted into its path. The resulting explosions weren't enough to destroy the machine, but they created a massive cloud of ionized debris that blinded its sensors. In that moment of confusion, Theron gave the final order. He told Solar to ram the Sentinel's central sensor hub, with the ship's reinforced prow. The impact was a world-ending thud. Theron was thrown forward against his harness, the wind knocked out of him. The sound of grinding glass and metal was deafening. The Indomitable Spirit's prow, reinforced with the thickest armor plating from a heavy cruiser, punched through the Sentinel's obsidian skin like a needle through a bubble. Inside the Sentinel, the vacuum was filled with the sparking of alien circuitry. Theron ordered the engineering team to vent the fusion core's plasma directly into the breach. A torrent of white-hot energy poured from the ship into the Sentinel's interior, a localized sun that melted the crystalline structures from the inside out. The Sentinel shuddered, its limbs flailing as its primary processors turned to slag. With a final, silent explosion of light, the machine shattered, its fragments scattering into the void. The Indomitable Spirit backed away, its nose crumpled and its systems failing, but it was still in one piece. The bridge was a wreck of shattered glass and smoke, but as Theron looked around, he saw his crew standing up. They were bruised, they were bleeding, but they were grinning. They had killed a Sentinel. They had proven that the machines could be broken. Theron slumped back in his chair, his heart racing. He looked out at the debris of the Sentinel and then at the distant coordinates of Event Horizon Alpha. They still had a long way to go, and the Vorax would eventually send a full swarm to investigate the loss of the Sentinel. But they were no longer just running toward a sanctuary. They were running toward a weapon. They were the last of their kind, a collection of ghosts on a broken ship, and they had just discovered that they were the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Theron took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and felt a strange, fierce peace. They were humans, and they weren't going anywhere. He looked at Sola, who was already plotting the course to the black hole. He told her to take them out of the graveyard. They had a war to start. The final leg of the journey toward Event Horizon Alpha was a silent, agonizing crawl through the gravitational distortion of a binary black hole system. The Indomitable Spirit was a ghost of its former self, a jagged collection of salvaged hulls and exposed scaffolding that groaned under the immense tidal forces. Theron stood on the bridge, his feet braced against a floor that vibrated with a discordant frequency. To their left, the primary singularity, a sphere of absolute nothingness rimmed by a violent, swirling accretion disk of white-hot plasma, consumed the light of the neighboring star. The radiation levels were so high that the lead shielding on the observation ports began to pit and cloud. Sola was lashed into her seat with industrial webbing, her eyes bloodshot as she fought the localized time dilation effects that made every second on the bridge feel like a distorted eternity. They were navigating a narrow corridor of stable space, a gravitational eye where the opposing pulls of the two black holes cancelled each other out. It was a place where no machine would ever venture by choice, for the chaos of the math would overwhelm even the most advanced Vorax logic core. Theron watched the sensors as a faint, metallic signature emerged from the glare of the accretion disk. It was the research station, a small needle-like spire of polished chrome that seemed to be hanging by a thread over the abyss. As they drew closer, the station began to broadcast a low-frequency pulse, a rhythmic thud that matched the heartbeat of the crew. It wasn't an automated defense signal, it was a handshake. Theron ordered the docking clamps to be primed, knowing they had only one chance to latch onto the station before the orbital decay pulled them into the event horizon. The Indomitable Spirit nudged against the spire, the metallic clang echoing through the ship like a funeral bell. Miller and a team of technicians were already at the airlock, their environmental suits reinforced with heavy-duty radiation plating. When the seals hissed open, they didn't find a welcoming committee. They found a tomb of science. The researchers had been dead for decades, their bodies preserved in the pressurized, oxygen-rich environment. They hadn't died of hunger or the Vorax, they had died of old age, waiting for a relief fleet that never came. Theron walked through the central laboratory, his boots clicking on the pristine white tiles. In the center of the room sat a device no larger than a standard power cell, suspended in a magnetic bottle. It was the entropy well, a weapon designed to broadcast a localized field that accelerated the decay of crystalline structures. It was the ultimate off switch for the Vorax plague. But the discovery was cut short by a proximity alert that shook the station to its foundations. On the bridge, Solar screamed that the Vorax had followed them. Not a scout, not a sentinel, but a swarm prime. A massive, interconnected lattice of 1,000 harvesters moving as a single, sentient entity. It had entered the gravity well, its crystalline hulls glowing with a fierce, protective aura that allowed it to resist the tidal forces. The Vorax had realized that the Indomitable Spirit wasn't just a stray ship. It was a threat to the grand equation. They were coming to erase the error once and for all. Theron looked at the entropy well and then at his ship. The device was too small to affect a whole swarm from a distance. It needed a massive power source to amplify the signal, something like a failing fusion core. He realized with a cold, unwavering clarity what had to be done. They couldn't run anymore. There was no more space to fold, no more nebulae to hide in. This was the end of the line. He ordered the evacuation of the station, telling Miller to bring the device on board and tether it directly into the primary power couplings of the Indomitable Spirit. Theron called a final assembly of the crew in the cargo bay. 3,000 faces looked up at him, men, women, and children who had crossed the galaxy on a prayer. He told them that the Indomitable Spirit was going to make its last jump. He told them about the escape pods, the small, shielded craft they had salvaged from the Accord fleet. They would launch into the gravitational slip of the black hole, using the planet-sized gravity to slingshot themselves away from the system while the ship stayed behind to hold the door. The crew was silent. There were no tears, no outbursts of fear. There was only a profound, collective acceptance. They had lived longer than anyone expected, and they had seen more of the universe than any human generation before them. One by one, they began to file into the pods. Carey stayed until the end, her hand resting on Theron's shoulder. She didn't say goodbye, she just told him to make it count. When the last pod was launched, the ship felt impossibly large and empty. Only Theron, Solar, and Miller remained on the bridge, the three who had steered the ship through every storm. The Swarm Prime was closing in, its violet beams already beginning to lick at the edges of the station. Theron took the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls. He looked at Solar, who was monitoring the entropy well's charge, and Miller, who was manually overriding the safety limiters on the fusion core. They were going to turn the Indomitable Spirit into a literal beacon of destruction. As the Vorax lattice surrounded them, its crystalline towers interlocking to form a cage of light, Theron initiated the sequence. He felt the ship begin to vibrate, not from the engines, but from the raw power of the entropy field. The metal of the bridge began to tarnish and flake away in seconds, the leather of the chairs crumbling to dust. The entropy well was working. Outside, the effect was even more dramatic. The Vorax harvesters, the perfect, indestructible machines, began to shatter. Their crystalline hulls turned to a fine, white powder that was instantly sucked into the black hole. The Swarm Prime shrieked in a frequency that bypassed the ears and vibrated in the soul, a mechanical scream of 1 billion processors dying at once. The Indomitable Spirit was dissolving around them. The viewscreen shattered, leaving them staring directly into the void through the flickering containment shields. Theron watched as the Swarm Prime collapsed, its geometric perfection turning into a chaotic cloud of glass shards. The plague was being unmade. Every Vorax within 10 light-years would feel the ripple of the entropy pulse, a cascading failure that would buy the survivors the time they needed to reach the true fringe. Theron looked at Solar and Miller. They were smiling. They weren't afraid of the dark anymore. The ship's internal lights flickered and died, replaced by the brilliant, blinding radiance of the entropy field. As the fusion core reached its critical mass, Theron took one last breath, a deep, full breath of recycled air that tasted of ozone and victory. He reached out and touched the terminal, sending a final broadcast on all frequencies, a message for anyone still listening in the ruins of the galaxy. We are human, we were here, and we do not go quietly. The explosion was not a sound, but a total erasure of the night. The Indomitable Spirit vanished in a flare of white light that outshone the twin black holes for a single, glorious moment. The entropy wave expanded outward, a silent ring of decay that turned the Vorax blockade into dust. Far away, the escape pods caught the gravitational wave, their heat shields glowing as they were flung into the deep black, heading toward a cluster of untainted stars. In the silence that followed, the Ophiuchus Reach was empty of machines. The archives were gone, the ship was gone, and the commanders were gone. But in the small, cramped pods, children were waking up to the sight of a new sun. They carried the stories of the Indomitable Spirit, the legend of the ship that wouldn't break, and the people who wouldn't bow. Humanity had been reduced to a handful of sparks in a hurricane, but those sparks were moving toward the dawn. The weight of a single breath had become the foundation of a new world, a testament to the fact that as long as one heart beats in defiance, the void has not won. The galaxy was vast, and the shadows were deep, but for the first time in an age, the darkness was no longer hungry.